Want to say aloha everyone and welcome. My name is Conrad Ng. I am a he, him, or his. I'm the executive director of Shangri-La Museum of Islamic Art, Culture, and Design in Honolulu, Hawaii. It's on the Aina of the Hawaiian Kingdom. I'm so very humbled actually to be invited to moderate this BIPOC DC conference panel on architecture. I wanted to send some snaps and shout outs before we sort of get into things to the BIPOC DC conference organizers, Inessa and Aki. You women are my heroines for sure. And Jason, who is behind the scenes right now. You're my hero too, man, so appreciate you. Also want to send some snaps and shout outs to today's panelists who just a few minutes ago, I told them that I was big fans of theirs. I was rock stars, or as the kids say, I was standing for them. But before we continue with introductions and sort of turn the screen over to them, just a little brief context for the BIPOC conference. Last year, around this time in June, is the 1-year anniversary since many companies and institutions made public their commitments to anti-racism. And like the first BIPOC conference, the second one is a forum for people in various industries, people of color, indigenous people, Black voices, to share their experience and to begin a conversation that's in many ways long overdue. And so this is an opportunity, this conference, to bring together some of what sparkles in the things that we aspire to do in our professional life. That's to say, the people. So I'm very excited to have this conversation with the folks, and so I'm going to ask our panelists today to introduce themselves, the name, and the like, the pronouns, title, the company that they work for, or built from the ground up, maybe a key project or two, and a land acknowledgement. So I'm going to move in the order of sort of my boxes. So Chris, Isabel, Shinpei, Dayton, just it might be a little random, but that's because my boxes are scattered on the screen. So let me begin with you, Chris.
Thank you, Conrad. So great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm Chris Leong, partner at Leong, a architecture firm and creative consultancy founded with my brother Dominic in New York City, which is on the land of the Munsee Lenape people. I go by he, him, his. And yeah, that's it.
Okay, thank you. Chris, Isabel?
Sure, hi everybody, thank you for joining us. My name is Isabel Castilla. I go by she, her, or ella in Spanish. I am originally from the land of the Taino, which is also called the Borinquen Island or Puerto Rico. And I am currently a principal at the firm James Corner Field Operations. We're a landscape architecture and urban design firm. And most of my projects concentrate on high-profile transformative projects that seek to bring public spaces to cities that are in need. I've been leading work on the High Line in New York City for the past 10 years. And recently, we also opened another project, the Underline in Miami, that I've been working on for the past 6 years.
Thank you. We'll move to Dayton.
Hey everyone, my name is Dayton Schroeder. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm an architect and principal with the Smith Group. My projects include the National Slavery Museum at the Lumpkin Slave Jail, the recent DC Water Headquarter building, Universal Hip Hop Museum, Southwest Waterfront Hotels at the Wharf, Freedom High. There's a lot. And I'm based out of Washington, DC. On the land of the Nachatan or the Anacostan, and I'm really super happy to be here.
All right, thank you. And Shinpei.
Hi everyone. It's really great to be a part of this conversation. Shinpei, it's hi, she, her, hers. I'm on the land of the Ramaytush, and I'm the global head of cities and transportation policy for Uber Technologies. My mandate is to help the company be better partners to cities. I do everything from leading the sustainability effort with our head of sustainability to looking at multimodal opportunities from transit and micromobility, and even some of the social impacts. So looking at systemic inequities in transportation and how we can overcome them with the company. So really a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, great, thank you. And again, thank you to each of you for your time today. I was just thinking about, as I was hearing your projects, that when I was an undergrad and thinking about what would be my major, and at the top of the Maslow's hierarchy of achievement was like architect, I ended up being philosophy, which is probably a little lower. It's like kind of where you'd put, more things like blankets maybe, or something about that hierarchy of needs. But it's really terrific to hear some of the work that you've done, and that especially as many of us walk through those spaces, we don't realize the type of care and intentionality that gets manifested through your labors. As I started, one of the things that is important about this conference is just to bring these voices to a space of visibility. And I mentioned that earlier as we were talking prior to the start of this this panel, was being able to look at the screen and to see, in many ways, experiences or voices that are familiar to me, that I feel I might be able to find a home in, literally, because you're all architects. And you all are at a level of leadership. And so I think it's probably important for people who are discovering us right now to wonder, how did you get to the station in life that you're at professionally? Across industries, BIPOC representation at leadership levels is persistently low and stubbornly so. And statistically speaking, when people are sitting in a room, there's a very small percentage of principals, of directors in our industry. So what would you want to share with people about becoming arriving at where you're at professionally? How did you get there? So I'm going to take one moment to let you folks think about that journey, and then I'm going to probably go in reverse order. So Shinpei, I'm going to slowly talk because I'm going to direct it gently to you, so that not to put you necessarily on the spot. But what does it take to get and keep a seat at the table? That as a BIPOC woman, that you had to navigate what sorts of things. So I'll move it over to you, Shinpei.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for the thoughtful question. I was just reflecting on this quite a bit because I think I'm constantly surprised when recognized for leadership or being placed in a leadership position, as it doesn't mirror my experience in society as an Asian woman. And so I was thinking a lot about this and how, one of the things that I think about often is, and hold myself accountable to, is modeling behavior I want to see, because it's so challenging to find that leadership behavior to model, particularly as a BIPOC leader, where you're essentially integrating multiple selves as you try to project authority, know-how, and confidence. You're also grappling, I think, often with sort of, you could be unexpectedly shut out for whatever reason. And so I think it's this integration that needs to happen. And I think I've really tried to follow my instincts around where those situations and conditions kind of unfold for you to, or for myself to really express as many of those multiple selves and be comfortable with that as much as possible, and still feel challenged and take on a lot of responsibility. But I have to say, it is quite challenging. There are definitely times when I was at a ivory tower organization where it was really hard and would sometimes be able to shut the door and just really have a cry because there was so much stress in terms of presenting yourself that way. I was, and the last thing I wanted to say about that though is, being an outsider though is sometimes useful, right? I think it really helps you find ways of differentiating yourself, of following your instinct. While I was at that same organization, I got invited to be a part of the Venice Biennale, which would have been completely very unusual. And I should have asked for permission, but because I was already an outsider, I just decided to go say yes and to recognize it was something that would give me joy and just follow that kind of instinct in all these different settings that I've been a privilege to be a part of.
Yeah. Thank you, Shinpei. I mean, I want to turn it over to Dayton.
I'll position my response sort of as my origin story. I mean, because I think my story is a little bit weird and ironic in a way, because I got to where I am, I think, indirectly. At the outset of my career, I really had no intentions on working in corporate America. It just didn't seem realistic to me. I sort of had aspirations of doing my own thing. I had, at the time, I had big matted locks. I had like 3 locks that were like matted together, and my hair was down past my waist. And so, my goal was to sort of get into corporate America, learn everything I could, and get out as quickly as I can. So I was pretty intense. I kind of went in. I lived in the office. I was working day and night, weekends. Everyone thought I was insane. But that energy sort of translated into drive, or I guess was interpreted as drive. And out of that, I just got invited to start working on a lot of the boutique work that we do within the office, and just managed to gain the respect of a handful of colleagues that ultimately became champions and advocates of me and my work. It's like 1 year materialized, and 2 years, 3 years before I turned around and looked up. It was like 10 years had already passed, and I was sort of entrenched into and thrown into a position of leadership. So I've out of that came to the realization that there could in fact be an opportunity, and out of that had kind of just struggling to kind of find my own voice and myself in that struggle, and I think ultimately found a stride in terms of the type of work that I like to do, and a healthy balance in being able to do that work within the predominantly white environment that I operate in. So I was able to kind of find a good synergy in doing that, and it has just sort of made it my mission to ensure that Black professionals entering the profession don't have to go through a lot of the same, don't have to explore the same path that I had to take and learn what I had to learn in a very hard way. I want to make it easier for them coming in. So that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah. Thank you, Dayton. Isabel?
Thank you. So I think my response can be summarized in two key terms. One is outspokenness, and another one is thirst for learning and knowledge. As a Puerto Rican, I think I'm lucky that our culture is one that's extremely outspoken. We like to make friends with everybody. We like to speak out loud. We like to be heard. And having that background has allowed me to pretty much go into rooms where I don't know anybody, where I may be the only woman and the only person of color, and not be able to sit quietly. I need to speak my mind. I need to be part of the conversation, and I need to take leadership into whatever's happening. But professionally, to be able to take leadership, you need to be confident. And the main way in which I have been able to gain my confidence is through learning, and not just learning in the traditional word of going college and graduate school, which I was very lucky to do, but also learning on the day-to-day and pushing myself beyond the boundaries to learn from my profession, from others around me, to learn the ropes so that when I am in a room and I do speak up, I know confidently what I'm talking about. And a lot of that learning process, I would say, in the recent years professionally has come through putting myself out there, specifically going to construction sites for a small woman, Latin American woman, to show up on a construction site and direct construction workers. That is not, that's a big challenge. But by doing that, by putting myself out there, I've been able to teach myself, what does it mean to go from design, from an idea, to a drawing, to a material, to construction, and then later on to usage and the aging of that project as public spaces get used over time. And then bringing that learning and that experience back to the table so that when I am at project meetings, when I am taking a leadership role, it's not just that I'm speaking up, but I'm speaking up from experience that can help guide that project in a more concrete way. So to me, those are just very important things to keep in mind for everybody that's even just starting or considering this career. Keep pushing yourself and learning so that you can actually have a voice at the table that is meaningful and has some substance behind it.
Thank you, Isabel. Chris, your journey.
So my journey, I would say, starts in my childhood. You know, I practice, you know, with my brother. We started our practice in 2009. But before that, you know, our father was an architect, and he's actually originally from Hawaii. So we have a real strong connection to Hawaii. But he's, you know, an Asian American man growing up. We grew up in Northern California, sort of the only Asian American person in our town. But he was a self-taught architect. And so I think I always had the perception that architect was a difficult profession, that would never be easy. And that B, that, you know, I think to Shinpei's point that, you know, you're always going to be a little bit of an outsider. And so that always kind of colored my view of what architecture would be, is that it's going to be hard. And I think that's really important, that it is a really difficult profession to make it in, both financially, but also in terms of representation. I think things are a lot different, a little bit more different now than they were when I sort of was first in school. But reflecting on this question too, you know, we started our own practice. We kind of just dove in without really knowing what that would mean and how hard it would be. And it has been very hard at times. But we were really fortunate to also work with some really great, you know, brands and companies at the beginning. 3.1 Philip Lim, that was led by an Asian American CEO, Asian American designer. We worked with Siki Im. We worked with Opening Ceremony. We were actually very fortunate to have worked with companies and organizations that had a kind of BIPOC leadership. And I think reflecting on that, that was actually something that was really unique, that there was a kind of creative collaboration that we were fortunate to have in those very early years. And then I think we grew that to you know, be able to work with organizations like Asian Americans for Equality, who we're working with right now on some projects in terms of affordable housing, and also working with the Los Angeles LGBT Center, which we did their center in Los Angeles. And I think, you know, this idea of leadership, I think, really comes down to being able to find, you know, people that share kind of, you know, both representation, but also a collective network. And I think that's been super important for us, you know, just to like work in a very difficult field, but just to find people that you can collaborate with that share the same goals per se. So I think that's been what's sort of really kept us going, even though I would say it's been challenging sort of every year that we've been practicing, even though I think we're really privileged and lucky to be where we are.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. You know, I'm really struck at first of all, thank you for everyone sharing kind of the insight in their journey, you know, sort of in the field of architecture and getting to the place where you're at. And I'm struck by, you know, what some of the common threads, which are not necessarily unique to, to anyone in America, right? Which is the sense of like labor and commitment and, you know, the sort of hard work, right? That sort of, you know, American spirit of you work it and you create the self-invention and you be yourself. in your success. You're responsible for it. But at the same time, to phrase it that way is also not recognize the type of additional labor that it takes for, to create and realize those opportunities that may not be readily apparent because of the history of racism or because of a lack of resources. And so each of you have talked about, developing a sense of resilience and creating that opportunity. And then when you're there, thinking back about how those opportunities could be realized for more people or made easier for your own journey. And so my kind of other question is this idea of change and progress. What types of changes or that you feel you can do now that would work to make it easier, right? So for example, for someone in our field to succeed or to open up more opportunities, what things aren't working in your view that could be changed and adopted by the field for people in architecture. I'm just really struck by how everyone works hard. I mean, that's a given, especially for people who are successful like you, like each of you. And now that you are, and it's still requiring work, what sorts of opportunities would you realize? What would work? What doesn't work? So I'm going to take a pause there so you can sit with that. And then I think I'm going to ask Isabel, to start us off.
Sure. So, I mean, I think we are currently at a moment where we're at a crossroads in terms of how BIPOC representation has a stronger role in the design field, I think, and in many fields. I think the events of last year have really raised awareness to racial diversity and how, the United States is a place of diversity and how that diversity needs to be celebrated. But I think it also has resulted in what I would call perhaps a superficial assessment of that. Before last summer, I always came into projects because of what I could offer to that project in terms of skills, in terms of knowledge, in terms of my craft as a landscape architect. And since last summer, I've noticed there's a bit of a shift in which teams are being formed or projects are being formed by creating diversity, by selecting these token needs within the project. We need to have the token Latinx, the token African American, the token person of Asian culture to show a diverse team. And that to me actually undermines what we can offer. I think teams should be formed by people that are capable, and in an ideal world, those people are diverse naturally. We shouldn't be selecting so specifically because in a way, it kind of, I think, undermines who we are and what we can offer to the table. But ultimately, I think all of that results from the fact that there isn't a lot of diversity in the field, that there is a need to be so selective. And I think that spawns from the fact that all the way down to education. When I think about my background growing up in Puerto Rico, and when I think about my graduating high school class, 50% of people that graduate with me are accountants, because when we were in high school, we were told, you low middle class kids from Puerto Rico, this is what you need to aspire to. No one ever told us you could be an architect, you could be a designer, you could be someone that makes a difference beyond the island. I mean, for me, moving away from Puerto Rico was a huge step. But the reason I'm saying this is because I think it stems back to education. How can we make these professions more available to communities of color, to communities that perhaps don't have that much access to know what architecture is, to know what museum design is, graphic design, and allow kids to see that these are career paths that they can take. How can we be mentors to those kids so that we can actually increase diversity in the profession? And in the future, arrive at what I would hope is the ideal world where we do have teams that are composed of people of multiple ethnicities, cultures, backgrounds that are contributing because of their abilities and craft. They're contributing to a more diverse design approach to projects rather than one that perhaps is led by few, or one where people are participating just because they need to check that box rather than actually make a meaningful contribution.
Thank you, Isabel. I saw some, nods from everyone else, so I'm going to open it up. Does someone want to hop in on that question about working and what's not working, and some of what Isabel had just shared?
I'll tap in. I agree with some of that. There's specifically this issue of the superficial, right? I think there's a lot of surface level change happening in our culture, in our profession, and it holds the appearance of change, but it's so limited in its capacity to really change the underlying framework and systems that support white supremacy. But I believe that, if oppression and exploitation is systemic and selective, then the methods for combating oppression and exploitation should be equally systemic and selective, right? So there's a conundrum where, I think we don't necessarily want to not acknowledge the selectiveness of the process by which peoples in this country specifically were exploited when it comes to talking about corrective solutions and reparations. And I think we have to center the historically oppressed in the equation of the solution, and not rely so much on changing the attitudes of the dominant culture or the historical oppressor. Because I think there's so much emphasis being put and reliance being put on this idea of changing the attitudes of the dominant culture to in effect, change the industry as a whole. So in a lot of the advocacy work that I do, I focus on empowering, Black, Brown, and Indigenous people by developing the skill sets and the tools that they need for navigating spaces that are dominated by whiteness, because that's the reality that I had to come through. That's the reality that a lot of us exist in. And I find that the most effective and genuine allies sort of emerge out of that equation, because they recognize and respect that and tend to make themselves available to be, actors in the equation of change. So for me, I think, while I do agree that the tokenism is an issue, when you look at privilege is the result of tokenism. That's essentially what it is. You're looking at 400 years of accumulated advantage, taken at the backs of oppressed people. But now that we're talking about reparations, everyone wants to kind of challenge this idea of selectivity, as if their privilege itself wasn't selective. So that's why I was had a look on my face.
Yeah,
it's a good one. Yeah, it's a good one. Chris or Shin-Pei?
I was going to jump in and say, I agree with so many things that Dayton just outlined, and I think really, I think for me a little bit been like identifying that the discipline of architecture, the education of architecture, the practice of architecture is just so much centered on whiteness, and I think that's an important thing to acknowledge. It's starting with education, and I think even what we're taught, what are the kind of the principles, back to Vitruvius, like there is a kind of way that the discipline is set up to view kind of Western canon of ideas and accept colonialization as a kind of the kind of accepted narrative that this is the way that things are, and that just stems from the ideas. I think if you look at the actual education and starting with colleges, you see a lot of diversity in the student body, but not so much in the professors and in the leadership. Maybe that's changing a little bit now, but I think what I've really seen over the past year, and that's and beyond, which I think is really the power of the collective. For me, it's been organizations like Design as Protest or Dark Matter University, or there's, other organizations out there where people are really just saying, forget the institution, we got to organize outside of it, because that's where the, that's where things kind of galvanize. And I think people are starting to envision kind of their own possibilities outside of the dominant framework, I think is really important. And I do feel like there's some energy around that right now.
Yeah, I would say that the efforts over the past year to find these alternative visions has been so inspiring. In my world, there's to Isabel's point, we are at a crossroads in, from urban planning perspective. There's so much value embedded in planning decisions that are taken for granted, and then the expression of the work, that labor that goes into them. There are all these white supremacist values that are baked into the way that that success is perceived, or quality, let's say, or in concepts is perceived. And there is a I would say reevaluation. I have to confess that I'm wondering about this bridge, right? So not to say that we need to adjust the attitudes of the privileged per se, but how to nurture these alternative visions so that they become something that everyone can partake in and take on more of the mainstream. It's quite a challenge, and I see, and I've experienced incredible resistance from the people in power to acknowledge the the racism and their own privilege, and the racism that they kind of indirectly or directly manifest. Interestingly, I spent 20 years in the nonprofit space working on built environment issues, and now I'm in the private sector. And I find it fascinating that in the private sector where I am right now at this huge global company, the senior leadership, the executive leadership, are far more willing to explore the discomfort than I have ever really witnessed in kind of the privilege of nonprofits, right? Because you're usually not the unspoken secret of or maybe it's not so secret of nonprofits. It's you need to be relatively privileged to stay in that field, because people are generally also, it's a struggle to kind of stay and be always scrappy and looking for resources, et cetera. And it's this juxtaposition that's very interesting to me that's happening right now, where you have these kind of explorations happening. It's uneven, I would say, and maybe privilege also creates some space to test, because you're starting from a place of comfort, and and so we are really definitely at a crossroads.
I'm just so fascinated about what has transpired and opened up over this past year in this conversation with respect to being able to articulate things like privilege and white supremacy, and a centeredness of dominant culture, and how that makes it cold for other people and marginalizes voices. These are conversations we couldn't have had necessarily in a way with ease or with some sense of familiarity among people outside of our communities, just even a year ago. And so one of the things that I want to put out there, and everyone can pick and choose who wants to answers, is you can work some levers. What are the levers that we would work in terms of holding on to the opportunities of this bridge time, this time where we can make some change with more people understanding the why as opposed to the no? What sorts of things would we dismantle and change? What things would you do with the levers that you hold to create a space that's more effective and deeper than sort of the tokenism that often gets tossed around in any of the fields, but particularly in architecture? So I'll open it up. Who wants to share some thoughts, drop some knowledge on that?
Yeah, I'll speak. I'll tune in. I mean, one of my biggest challenges and hurdles is just combating the superhero complex, right? I think there's or the savior complex. I mean, you know, with white supremacy comes the burden of entitlement, where it's assumed that the power of change is beholden to the dominant culture, dominant class. And the message that I have had to say over and over and over is that I don't want to be saved. You know, I want to be a principal actor in my own salvation and empowerment. You know, I want to be a leader in redeveloping myself and my community. And so this notion of empowering, you know, BIPOC individuals to be those forces of change, I think is important, because as I do more and more of this work, again, a lot of the work I do is social justice oriented work. You know, it's almost as if you have to kind of even fight to have a voice, you know, in that work, and to be part of the equation. You have people who have historical privilege, who oftentimes will come in and will push people out of the equation, you know, given their historical roles and their position. And so I find that oftentimes I find myself having to be a referee, and sort of manage the process, and ensure that the people who need to be empowered are actually empowered. And so that's been my biggest struggle, this since 2020. It's I think we've made a lot of progress internally within our organization with the consultants we work with, but it's an uphill battle.
Thank you. Someone else want to share some of the levers that we would work, some of the things that we would do?
I can say on my end, what I'm the most interested about is mentorship. It's allowing people that are either interested in the field, that know about the field but are not sure how they can, you know, progress in it, or even people that don't know about it. Starting with high school students that are exploring what their careers could be, providing mentorship to show them what are the possibilities within the career, but also how people like themselves can see them grow into a position of leadership. I never had that. I made my way through. I think in a way I was so naive. I didn't understand that there was discrimination until I experienced it directly, and I pushed through. But when I did, it would have been nice to actually have a mentor that would help me overcome some of those issues that I faced. And I do a lot of work with high school students, with college students, mostly in Latinx communities that don't have a lot of exposure to what we do in Puerto Rico, in Dallas, in California. And I get a lot of questions of how do we get there? What do we need to do? We don't know anybody like you. And to me, the current events, the current dialogue are a huge opportunity to open up the importance on mentorship, and to open up the idea that we're all different, we're all coming from different backgrounds, but the ultimate goal is the same. And how do we help those that are similar to us reach that goal, and encourage them to know that they can, and that there are opportunities for them as much as there are for everybody else.
Yeah, to follow up on Isabel's comments, I agree with this idea of mentorship, and thinking about, I think for me personally, it's been thinking about this idea of platform, or, holding space for whatever, we have a, small sized architecture firm that's, been privileged to be able to work on certain types of projects. We teach, we've been co-teaching at universities, most recently at MIT, and our thinking around kind of our frameworks has evolved, really to think about how we can bring other voices into our teaching, into our practice. Most recently, we were teaching with a colleague, Sean Connolly, who's based in Hawaii, who helped us kind of, brought us into his community and so I think it changed the entire dynamic of how we taught in other semesters, which might have been a little bit more, here's the brief and everyone learns. I think the way we're thinking about approaching practice and about teaching is that there's so many different voices out there, and that, really what does it mean to hold space to share ideas, where architecture typically is such like a top-down discipline, which I think is in so many ways what's so wrong about it. And I think there's like so many ways to learn in which, whatever platform you do have can be the lever to both understand a situation differently, but also to kind of, expand and broaden what the work is.
I want to riff on that idea of a platform. And I think it's really important to understand where in the ecosystem you or perhaps your organization lives in that power dynamic, in whether or not you open up to alternatives and give legitimacy even. So there have been times in my career I started very small nonprofits and really needed to have mentors and champions in order to get into the room. And there are times where I've been at very, at global organizations that have long histories, or, now at a global organization that has created a platform, an extensive one, and understand that I need to be the one that creates the bridge and gives legitimacy to things that might be uncomfortable and to ideas that don't sit well. And it's been fascinating over this past year to test some of those efforts, right? To, one project we were working on in Harlem, just during COVID, wanting to extend dining areas for Black-owned restaurants, for the Black merchants. How can we also create an ecosystem of supporting Black entrepreneurship and help Black designers in the neighborhood to participate in shaping these spaces? Just entrusting the community-based organization, the designers, that entire community with I would say very little on our part. It was money, but it was a recognition that they had all the skills, they had the know-how, we trusted them. It was their community. I don't live in Harlem. It was such an empowering experience for everyone that participated in that project. And I think even to the extent, just as by way of an illustration of the legitimizing aspect and challenging inside-outside dynamics and privilege, this was a very, very unusual project for Uber to take on. We were essentially building something physical. It was very, very strange for unusual. And the legal the legal team just had endless questions about what exactly was going on. And then I was showing them the site plan and the designers that involved, the art that was integrated, and it was all this entire community, 38 eventually 38 professionals were involved. They were all BIPOC people. And it was transformative for people who were adjacent to the project. They were so proud of the fact that that was something that we supported, and I knew when I was talking to them that their view of the world, the built world, because now they were involved in the ins and outs of what it takes to get something done, was transformed. And if they're in any city that is now thinking about these public spaces, they have a completely different view, and they have a very different view of who gets to say how these spaces are created, which but it was a surprise. I kept going, and I kept thinking someone's going to shut this down, and I kept going and going. I was like, I'm going to take this as far as I can go, and now they are duplicating it in 10 cities. So I just think it's interesting, right? Like you try this stuff out and you try to create these openings, and you walk through the door and you're like, you could get kicked out, but maybe you won't.
I love this. And that sounds great, Shinpei. I love the sort of some of the narratives and the importance around mentors. And it occurred to me that it's also about these people being champions for you, as each of you are champions, for the field, but for also seeing opportunities for that currently may not seem to appear self-evident for other people. It's about believing, right? Being a champion is to believe. And I was thinking about, as I was listening to everyone, about what sorts of, to ask what sorts of resources, we talked about mentorship and opening opportunities, speaking truth to power, but are there other resources that you would share with people who are dialed in today, architects, people who love space, the built environment, and our interaction with it? What resources would you share for those who are of our communities, or who would want to understand what it means to be of this set of communities, as diverse as we are, and as as diverse as we are, and as the different approaches we take, and with our unique experiences? What resources would you want to share to be that champion, to be able to allow us to believe that at this bridge, we go to a place that may not be self-evident, as Shinpei said, but you should keep on keeping because it's going to somewhere that's different.
I would start by saying that a great resource is dialogue, and these kind of platforms like the one we're doing today, or others that are that have still started out there, because there's a lot of things that we don't talk about, and by not talking about them, we don't understand each other's perspectives. And I think that goes on a one-to-one level as professionals in the field, but it also goes when we design spaces. To me, one of the most interesting things about the work I do in designing public spaces is understanding the context for those that I'm designing for. It's not about the city, it's not about the neighborhood, but it's about the people that will go to that space. How are they? What are their needs? What are their interests? How are they culturally different? And how can we design a space that speaks to them? And that all happens through dialogue. That happens through endless community meetings where you sit down with that neighborhood and a plan of the sites, and you tell them, right here, where do you want to go play basketball? Where do you want to go walk your dog? Where do your kids want to play? And through that dialogue, you learn from them, and they also learn from you as a designer. What are you trying to achieve in that project, so that you balance everybody's interest and aspirations into one public space that fits, that works for everyone. And that's very similar to what you were saying with this Uber project. It's how do you bring those communities in and let them be part of the design? That idea of co-creation, the dialogue, the notion that design is a joint effort, and how through those dialogues we can then open up opportunities for that design to be tailored to those who use it the most, and through that learn from each other as part of the process.
Yeah, I really like that idea. I was going to say something kind of, maybe unrealistic, but, that sense of curiosity in terms of making connections with other organizations, it seems super important as a resource. I don't have a set resource, but that seems super important. And then the second thing that is really good to keep in mind for people looking at this field is, I hope, and it's, we're 5 different people here. There's lots of different kinds of leaders, and the world needs all of them, and don't try to fit someone else's version of it. I think being really cognizant of what you bring, your contribution, to be confident that you will make a contribution, I think is really important as we're trying to create this alternative vision, an alternative world, and maybe not the alternative, right? The world itself, the whole world. I think that's really important to keep in mind, especially as you are seeking connection with others.
Chris or Dayton?
Well, I'll keep it simple with respect to time, but I think at this point in our career, at least in my career, I kind of recognize that I am a resource, right? And so it's sort of, taking my position, taking my network, my connections, everything that I know, and kind of wielding that into into a way where I can sort of make myself accessible. You know, I'm doing, you know, all types of community outreach. We're working with HBCUs. You know, I'm probably spending at least 8 hours of every week on my own time, you know, meeting with students, making myself available to staff, you know, mentoring folks. Oftentimes I'm meeting off hours, you know, getting people connected, or, you know, pointing them to this organization or that organization. So I think, you know, at some point, you know, just recognizing your own power, right? And also, you know, again, there's organizations that have been out there, that have been established, that have been doing the work. You know, don't discount NOMA, right? They've been doing this work since the beginning, I think they should be more relevant than ever now, you know, as far as architects are concerned. So, you know, definitely, you know, try to tune in and get connected to NOMA, and just, you know, get plugged in and see how you can become a force within those organizations to be a resource.
Yeah, and I can, you know, in terms of resource, I mean, the most powerful resource that I can think of is you know, in addition to, you know, what Dayton said, I think is important, like all of us here being resources as individuals, and like what our immediate network is, and that's important. But I also see the ability to connect within your community, people that, you know, you identify with, that you connect with, and that I think there's a lot of power in that, you know, rather than just sort of looking to the top, looking to the institutions to change, which there's so much work to do. It's so far to go. At least, you know, and I know it's, you know, it's true. There's been organizations that have been out there for a long time that are great to connect with. And then there's a lot that kind of have more emerged more recently that are out there, that are open, you know, and like you know, BIPOC Collectors Club, like, you know, that places like this, like spaces like this are happening more quickly. And I've fallen into a lot of these groups personally, where people are just, starts with one person connecting to another to share ideas, and that built into like 4, that built into 8, that built into 12. And there's a lot of kind of organic things that are happening, and a lot of conversations that are happening. And that's where I feel like the resource has really been about this idea of shared community and holding space. And I hope that's something that we can keep going.
Yeah. We're approaching near the end of the time. It goes fast. So I have a closing question to each of you, and it's kind of a 2-part one. The first one is really like, what advice do you have for aspiring architects in the field, aspiring BIPOC architects in the field? But the second part of that is, I also want you to say something to each of us. You know, what advice would you give to each of us as senior executive, accomplished principals, directors in the field of architecture? We're brought together, and, you know, it's a good thing when you have this community. And sometimes I look to my colleagues and I think, you know, I just need some good advice and wisdom. And let me just start by saying to each of you, before I open it back up, is, you know, I work in a museum in which there are architectural elements from the Islamic worlds, from Morocco all the way to Indonesia. And when people come to visit the museum, they learn very quickly how cultural narrative can be manifested in space. And they can be taken to a place that they didn't think that they would start with when they arrive at the museum. And some of those reactions are, that reminds me of my grandfather's home, or this reminds me of my childhood. This reminds me of love. This reminds me of, or in some cases, if they can no longer return to a homeland, this reminds me of loss. And it's very powerful to be able to think how space, particularly how you all shape and bring in a certain sense of design, a certain sense of process that's inclusive and also about change. And so my advice is, in a lot of ways, I've said this earlier, is that in the moment where you feel challenged and decentered because no one's listening, there are people out there who need you to say what you need to say, because they don't know until you say it. So keep on keeping in that way. But what would you say for the other architects, and what would you say to us? And that's our final question. And I'll open it up to whoever wants to go first or whoever wants to go last.
I'll go first just because you actually took the phrase that I was going to say, which is keep on keeping on to this group. And I heard a lot of themes, common themes, but I also heard very different expressions of it in your work and the way that you approach your projects. And it's so, to me, that's also diversity and much needed, much necessary, and really wonderful that there's this spectrum of ways to be a leader in this work, which is architecture is a fairly small world compared to other industries. So that's really marvelous. And I had already kind of spent my time saying that I think everyone just needs, people who are looking to stay in this field and become leaders should just not be swayed by what leadership means to others and be true to what leadership means to themselves.
I would like to add to that because it's kind of along the same lines as what I was thinking of. I mean, I have spent a lot of time trying to imitate others, fit a mold, do what other leaders I see do that are not of my culture. And ultimately what I arrived at is that it's okay to be different. It's celebrate your differences, celebrate what you can bring to the table, because ultimately that sets you apart. It gives you a voice, but also it may touch on others that share similar backgrounds or similar thoughts. And what you just said, it was just so beautiful. That idea that through space, people, are taken back to their culture, their history, their families. I think we can do that through leadership too. How you behave, how you are as an individual will impact others, especially in design professions where it's all about collaboration. Being true to yourself, your culture in how you collaborate, and being open to learn from those others that are also different from you. I think that will lead to the best collaboration possible, both at the same level as directors, but also for those that are up and coming, to be open about what they can bring to the table and to learn from others as well.
I mean, I would just, reflect and say that I think, how can we bring architecture back to people? I think there's a lot of ways in which the discipline ignores people, who they are, where they came from, what their histories are. I think that's sort of, it gets talked about a lot, but I think it gets really lost, I think, in the process. I think that's super, super important. And I think to both acknowledge that as a practitioner, but also, I mean, in a way that's advice too, that I would like to think that we can design more equitable processes to arrive at more equitable outcomes. And I would hope that, we would think about how we could change the metrics of success for the future generation of architects. And that, for everyone to embrace who they are is really important, and to acknowledge that our differences. But that, I think that's where really, that's kind of what it comes down to, is how we can sort of embrace our individuals and our selves and our social selves.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in. I mean, I think, for me, it starts with, the fundamentals, mastering your craft. Also, I think, there's so much emphasis on being an advocate nowadays. I always tell young people, don't chase being an advocate until you do the work. Because the design world has developed this cult of personality that I think social media has helped to create, that puts more emphasis on celebrity than on people actually doing the work. And I really agree with this notion of that everyone's sort of alluding to, of being you. I think there's so much power in embracing your authentic self and discovering your own voice, and just being resolute in that. When I was using terms like white supremacy, 3 years ago, people would leave the room. And now all of a sudden it's like an accepted term, and everyone gets it. But, just being resolute. And I think that also starts with knowing your history and being grounded in facts and truth. And also understanding the mechanics of the politics of today, understanding and also understanding policy and how those policies influence the ecosystem of the different design industries, not only just architecture. So I think, I think knowing yourself is much broader than just knowing yourself, right? It's also kind of knowing your position to the world, is where I'm going. And also, I also tell people, be humble. I think that's important too, but also keep some arrogance in your back pocket. I think because there's always those occasions where someone is going to doubt you or wants to project their own false sense of superiority. So I think having some arrogance in your back pocket goes a long ways sometimes. And I think the advice for the group as a whole is kind of this. I agree. It's like, be you, know your authentic history, know your authentic self, and base who you are on a true identity, and not an assumption of what your identity is. There's a saying that if you don't understand white supremacy, that everything you think you know will only confuse you. So I think I always took that, forgot who said that, but I always take that and hold that, close and near and dear to my heart.
Thank you all. We are over time, but I'm going to just play timekeeper and say one last question, because this is, I think, really sort of important, at least to me. And I said this in our email. It's been a long year, I think, for many of us. And so I'm just going to ask, what's one thing of joy that has been manifested in your life recently? And I'll just start, and we can just share, and that'll be our last question. But I have to say that not everyone's a big hugger. I'm sort of a hugger. I had like the best hug yesterday. It was like one of the best, like probably top 5, if not top 2. And it was like there, and without any worry or concern about why this would be not a good thing to do. And I liked it. Like, I was like, okay, this is pretty good. I think I can do this more and more and more. So it brought me great joy to have that hug. Okay, so I'm gonna open up. You all have to share. So everyone's got to share some joy.
I'll start. I think for me, it's really been about appreciating family and learning to appreciate the things that love me, as opposed to chasing the things that are always just challenging you and don't really love you back. Like put your love into things that love you back, because that's what really matters. I mean, that's my joy.
We've had a year of a microcosm of social connections. We just moved to San Francisco before the pandemic, and from New York. After 20 years in New York, so our whole community was really in New York, and got to know our neighbors because, the social distancing thing. And they had a Friday happy hour every week to alleviate the social isolation. I think the greatest joy is over the course of the year, spending time with them here and there. They hosted a birthday party for my toddler, who turned 3 a couple weeks ago. And people were so excited to have a reason to celebrate. It was such a moment of joy, and it was public. It was on the block. So people walking by saw the balloons and the cake and the costumes. So it was really wonderful to see how quickly something like that could develop, even in spite of a pandemic.
I'll go real quick. I had the pleasure of traveling an installation that I created last year in the aftermath of the George Floyd death, called Society's Cage, and it's all about educating people about the history of anti-Black racialized state violence through lynching, mass incarceration, capital punishment, and police killings. And just have had the pleasure to begin touring it around the country, and just being able to just establish some incredible bonds with people around the country through this shared history and this reckoning. It's just been a powerful experience. I just got back from Tulsa, Oklahoma for the centennial of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, and where we brought the installation. It's just been a phenomenal experience. So I'm kind of looking forward to keeping that going and you know, just exploring new connections through that project and others.
Okay, and finally, for me, the closing comment. I think for me, joy has come in two ways. Professionally, I've been lucky enough that I've been able to open 2 public parks, one in Miami and one in Dallas, in the middle of the pandemic, which is just incredible that we were able to finish construction, open these public parks while people were still not vaccinated, and be able to offer these communities space to socialize in a safe manner. To me, that has just been extremely joyful. And over the past few weekends, now that most of my friends and family are vaccinated, I've made a point to dedicate each weekend to spend very meaningful time with a dedicated group of friends. And I'm on weekend 8. It feels like a summer of party post-COVID, but it's just so important to actually be spending several days with friends that I haven't seen in years and actually enjoy things together for the first time in so long.
All right. Thank you all. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for your voices. Thank you for your work. Really grateful. And thanks to everyone out there who tuned in. I hope you feel as kind of great as I feel right now, just listening to all these folks. Thank you. And we'll meet in person sometime, right? We'll do that. All right. Be well and aloha all.
Thank you.
Bye.